thank you very much for being here today and for giving me, thank you, the opportunity to speak with you. My lecture will be slightly different than the others that you've heard. I will be focusing on the importance of raising awareness about the topic of medicine, ethics, and the Holocaust, the importance of hearing every lecture that came before mine and all of the scholars that we are fortunate enough to have here today, creating accurate resources moving forward that we can use in order to disseminate this very important knowledge, because only by doing that can we ensure that the stories of those who perished during the Holocaust are not forgotten, and that we are retelling them accurately in a way that allows us to use these lessons. I founded an organization to do everything that I just said. It's called the Maimonides Institute for Medicine, Ethics, and the Holocaust. Our mission is to explore the ethical implications of the medical transgressions that took place during the Holocaust for modern scientific theory, medical practice, healthcare policy, and human rights endeavors. Our motto is remember the past, protect the future. Because only by remembering the past can we ensure that we will be able to protect the future. Why is it important to study the Holocaust specifically as it pertains to medical ethics? The Holocaust is the only example of medically sanctioned genocide in history. What do I mean when I say that? You've heard some of what I'm about to tell you, so I will not elaborate too much. However, social issues were transformed into medical problems. People were labeled as physically, mentally, or racially inferior based on this idea of scientific or medical evidence. Now, to repeat the point made earlier by Professor Hildebrand, we now think of eugenics as being a pseudoscience, but it's very important to understand that at the beginning of the 20th century, that is not how it was seen. The rise of eugenics internationally, the idea of bettering society by improving human heredity, it was an internationally accepted scientific theory. Science would determine who is worthy of living and who should die, and medicine would then be responsible for carrying out those death sentences. So, German eugenics in particular took this in a slightly different direction. Individuals were viewed as parts of a whole. They were productive members of society only if they could benefit the German nation, which was seen as having its own health. It was seen as a living, breathing organism. So there's a very important paradigm shift that takes place here. Rather than caring for the individual, as doctors had been trained to do, dating back to, obviously, the Hippocratic Oath, instead, physicians shifted and they became responsible for caring for society. And again, that's very important in understanding everything that happened next and how something like this could take place. German eugenics was built on the utilitarian perspective that individual rights were not important and should be subverted in favor of what's best for society. So social problems became biological or medical problems. Eugenics was used as the scientific medical justification for carrying out the Nazi political goals. And so you have a merger, and it's very important to understand this merger between medicine on the one hand and politics on the other that comes together to create the biological state. Again, some of this has already been spoken about, and so I will not dwell on it further, except to say that obviously we know today that the merger of medicine and politics in the Third Reich had disastrous results. we were using this as a way to create public health measures and enact public policies that were not in keeping with what was in the best interest of the individual, but with what was perceived to be in the best interest of society. An example is abortion, which during the Third Reich was used as a public health measure to prevent the unfit from reproducing. This is one step further than the sterilization that was taking place, obviously, in the United States, where Hitler looked for inspiration. And so you can see, if you look back at some of the Nazi propaganda, in Nazi Germany, abortions were illegal for all healthy Aryan women, but they were enforced for eugenic reasons on other women. Obviously, medical experimentation in World War II, which is what most people assume the topic of my lecture will be. Again, without going into too much detail, I'm just trying to give you an overview of the topic at large. Doctors performed 26 different types of medical experiments with the goal of obtaining information that could be used, again, not to treat the individual person, but to advance science, medicine, the military, and society. Concentration camps were a unique opportunity to access human subjects for research purposes without any legal or ethical boundaries. Obviously, no informed consent was given. And these two concepts that are incredibly important to remember, dehumanization and medicalization, were what allowed physicians to abandon the Hippocratic Oath. So what did physicians actually do? Because again, most of the time people assume that I'm just going to be speaking about Mengele. So Professor Skotnicki, he did a much better job of explaining what physicians do during the Holocaust, and so I don't necessarily feel that I need to repeat it, again, except to say that there was a systematic, comprehensive participation of the medical community. And so what happened when we, as an international society, found out about the abrogation of ethics that took place during the Holocaust? We created the Nuremberg Code, which involves 10 characteristics of acceptable research involving humans. The first principle, which is obviously a direct result of learning what exactly had taken place, was that the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. The Nuremberg Code was seen by many as being the birth of modern bioethics. It placed autonomy above all other principles, but it was problematic because those who could not give voluntary informed consent, vulnerable populations, there was no good way of dealing with that issue. And as medical science and technology continues to advance, we continue to have these issues. How do we decide? How do we regulate? How do we enforce the protection of human dignity? And this is where we switch over into modern day. Just because we can, does that mean we should? We have the capability now of doing things medically. You all, as physicians, have the ability to do things that were unimaginable even just 10 years ago. And 10 years from now, you will have the ability to do even more things. But does that necessarily mean that we should? There's a difference between what is possible and what is ethical, what is legal. And I would say that above all else, we're always going to continue to advance. We need to respect and protect the individual patients. So they too asked and answered the question, who shall live and who shall die, and who belongs to the community entitled to our protection? Then and now, the subject at hand is killing and letting die, and helping to die, and using the dead. Then and now, the goal is to produce healthier human beings and perhaps a better quality of human being. These are the bioethical issues that we are facing now. I could talk about this for several hours, but I will not do that because I'm last and I'm sure you're all tired. There are four major areas that I think are important to understand: beginning of life, end of life, human subject research, and human rights efforts. You will see here the casebook on bioethics and the Holocaust, written by my friend and colleague, Dr. Tessa Shalhoub. She will talk to you about it a little bit more later. A brief overview. The Human Genome Project was created in 1990. The intention was to discover the cause of disease and to determine the treatment and the cure. Those are good motivations. However, there are possible negative outcomes of choosing the quality society deems favorable for future generations. How do we make sure that the practical application remains good? Stem cell research. These are questions of human rights, ethical principles, the use of evidence-based scientific facts as opposed to the politicization of medicine. And there's a quote in here from 2009. President Obama in the United States reversed a 2001 executive order that limited federal funding for stem cell research. And in his speech, he promised to make scientific decisions based on facts, not ideology. We all need to be doing that. So again, this is well beyond my scope of knowledge. CRISPR is a tool that enables scientists to target a specific area of a gene. It works like the search and replace function in Microsoft Word, which is the best explanation I've ever seen for non-medical people, to remove a section and insert the correct sequence. So again, there's great potential here. There's great possibility. It's an amazing scientific discovery. But how are we going to regulate the use of this technology and figure out who decides and enforces it? Medical genetics and genetic engineering, right? In the United States, I'm not sure if this is all over the world, we have a little kit that will be sent directly to you, and you can find out your DNA sequence and all of that. It does not come with any type of scientific explanation, so or ethical explanation. So what is the proper use of genetic testing? And who determines that, right? How will the data we obtain from genetic testing be used? And how should it be used? Is this a personal choice? Is it a societal choice? And should there be governmental regulations to ensure the proper use of this medical advancement? As you can see, these are not easy issues. They're not black and white, and they require accurate information, an understanding of history, and how history impacts our current issues, and a forum for discussion about it. End-of-life care. I'm mostly going to talk about physician-assisted suicide, providing the means for a patient to end his or her own life. In the United States, doctors in certain states can prescribe lethal medications for mentally competent, terminally ill patients 18 and over, but cannot administer this medication. And that's largely based on the fear that the participation in the death of a patient could lead to indifference about the value of human life. It's not so crazy. We've seen it happen before. I will not presume to be an authority on European laws and policies, but I do just want to point out that both euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide are legal in Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, which creates certain ethical concerns about whether or not physicians who took an oath to heal, whether they should be allowed to kill. Should there be universal requirements? What kind? Who decides? The principle of vulnerability, informed consent, children, terminally ill people, and whether or not these countries in Europe become destination sites for non-citizens wishing to have access to euthanasia. I think case studies are one of the most important ways that we can have these conversations and educate people. So here are just a handful that I came up with. In 2012, 45-year-old twins were euthanized in Belgium after they learned they were going blind. So that's an example of a physical reason. In 2014, Belgian courts granted euthanasia requests from an inmate serving a 30-year sentence for rape and murder who feared he was still a threat to society. So that goes more towards the societal aspect. In 2009, a 39-year-old woman sought euthanasia in Belgium after a romantic breakup. She had a history of teenage mental illness, but had improved substantially as an adult. In February 2010, she received a new diagnosis of autism, and she was euthanized 2 months later, and that would fall under psychiatric use of this. And then in February of 2016, there was an article in JAMA Psychiatry that said 66 of 110 people who were euthanized between 2011 and 2014 in the Netherlands were euthanized despite the fact that there was no consensus between their consulting physicians. In the United States, after the Nuremberg Code was published, we said, that's not a code we need to pay attention to. That's a code for barbarians. We're not barbarians. Except, during that time, we were involved in, and since that time, have been involved in several unethical projects and human rights abuses in vulnerable populations. We continue to struggle with human rights abuses in vulnerable populations throughout the world, and it's very important that we have these conversations in order to make sure that this does not continue to happen. The key is balance, right? There's a balance. How do we ensure a balance between scientific advancement and human dignity? The Holocaust is the only example of medically sanctioned genocide, which makes it very important, makes it a very valuable teaching resource. However, we need to find ways to draw similarities between things that are going on today. That being said, what's happening today is different than what happened then, and we need to make sure we strike a balance when we're discussing this between then and now. I am Jewish, and I learned about the Holocaust every year in Hebrew school through my family. It was considered to be a part of Jewish history. What I have learned from doing this work is it is an equally important part of medical history, and I would argue an equally important part of human history. So we all have a responsibility to learn about this, because if we don't learn about it, we're doomed to repeat our past mistakes. Science and ethics are not objective, distinct entities. They exist within the context of political, societal, cultural, religious, and economic settings. The healthcare profession is not immune to the abuse of power, and in fact has a tremendous responsibility because of the power placed in their hands. We've seen that Nazi physicians abandoned their responsibility to the individual patient in favor of a perceived duty to the nation and to advance societal progress. Science and medicine will and must continue to advance, but it is our responsibility to remain vigilant in order to ensure that the rights of the patient are respected and protected. And as I said earlier, there are differences between then and now, and we must be cautious in our use of the Nazi analogy. So to wrap up, as I said earlier, I don't approach this topic. I'm not a historian. I'm not a medical doctor. I have a doctorate in medical humanities, and I consider myself to be an activist. We created the Maimonides Institute, the UNESCO Department of Bioethics and the Holocaust of the UNESCO Chair of Bioethics, the Center for Human Dignity in Bioethics, Medicine, and Health, and Candle's Holocaust Memorial and Education Center, which was founded by Eva Moses-Kor, who is a survivor of Mengele's twin experiments, created a pledge to preserve human dignity in healthcare, because we can all do something. Some people can actually be part of the change in the medical profession. Some people historically provide accurate information. Some people will create curriculum. You can all go online. You can all go to www.mimeh.org and scroll down to see this pledge to preserve human dignity in healthcare. I would like to point out that Professor Gajewski was one of the first people to offer his unconditional support. You can see some of us are wearing these pins. The pins say dignity, equality, and health. And it is my hope that 10 years from now, you see a lot more people wearing these pins, and you know that they have taken an oath, that they are committed to human dignity and the concept of human dignity in healthcare, and the larger universal goal, remembering the past to protect the future. There's an importance of collaborating and working together on this topic. And it is a privilege and an honor for me not only to be here today, but also to announce that the Maimonides Institute for Medicine, Ethics, and the Holocaust will be working together with Piotr and everybody here, the wonderful people from Medical Review Auschwitz, to make sure that these programs continue and that we continue to provide these types of materials and these resources. So I want to thank you all very much for being here today and for understanding the importance of this topic.